The fight in the SEC versus Middleton case is no longer just about vacating a consent judgment that alleges fraud on the court, but now a second battle is underway. A district court is minutes away from closing a multi-million-dollar fund, discharging the people that ran it, and sending over $3 million to the U.S. Treasury. It sounds like the final chapter in a long legal saga, but for the defense, the books don't just look messy, they don't balance at all. On March 2nd, 2026, the defense fired back. And it's not just a standard set of objections. It's a 26-page autopsy of what they call a record-false accounting nightmare. It also comes with a supporting declaration that argues that some of the defendants' most detailed objections about missing records, custody gaps, and fee approvals were never rejected on the merits, but struck only on a formatting rule. Now, a $3 million black hole is at the center of a battle to stop the Treasury from taking money that might actually belong to the defendant. The SEC says 100% of potential victims are already paid and the case is closed. The defense argues that the accounting record contains a transaction from 8 months into the future, omits at least $2.5 million in legitimate expenses, and fails to reconcile what the defendants call a double recovery on more than $1.4 million in gold. Now, before we hit the explosive stuff in Doc 168, we need to look at the wreckage that led us here. The request. In document 158, the defendants requested a special master, which is a neutral auditor, to find out where all the crypto went after it left the controlled address and ended up in commingled landing points and exchanges like Binance. The admission. The SEC responded with Doc 159, a cover letter admitting their quarterly accounting reports omitted frozen asset transactions entirely. The strike. When the defendants tried to point this out in document 164, the court struck it from the record over a minor formatting rule. The recommendation. On February 17, 2026, the magistrate judge issued document 165, denying the auditor and recommending that the fund be closed and the money sent to the U.S. Treasury. The fight. Document 168 is the objection brief, and 169 is a declaration meant to restore what the defense says the court never weighed. The waiver fight. One of the sharpest attacks in 168 is aimed at the waiver ruling used to dismiss the defense. The magistrate judge said the defense waived its lieu argument in the 2019 consent judgment, citing paragraph 18. Document 168 points out that paragraph 18 actually deals with statements to the SEC, not a waiver. Defendants argue if the key legal reasoning is built on a wrong citation, the entire logic for ignoring the accounting errors falls apart. The $2.5 million expense gap, the lieu problem. This is where the law gets heavy. Under the Supreme Court case Lieu versus the SEC, the government can only take net profits, meaning they must deduct legitimate business expenses. The defendants point out that the SEC's own forensic witness documented $2.5 million in legitimate business expenses. These expenses were never deducted from the $7.8 million disgorgement figure. If these aren't deducted, the $3 million residual isn't a surplus. It's over-collected money, the defense argues, belongs with the defendants, not the U.S. Treasury. The Dillon Gage gold double recovery. The most concrete math error involves $1.4 million in physical gold. Back in 2018, Veritaseum used ETH to buy gold from Dillon Gage to back their fully redeemable VE Gold tokens. The SEC counted that $1.4 million as part of the gross proceeds for the disgorgement. Then they seized the physical gold, liquidated it, and put that money into the Fair Fund. That's counting the same money twice, once as a profit and once as a seized asset. The defense argues that this is a prohibited double recovery that the current accounting completely fails to reconcile. The fees and escrow violations. Document 168 argues that the fund administration violated the court's own controls, especially around fees and escrow custody. They emphasize the existence of a mandatory fee approval process. Application to the court, notice to defendants, opportunity to be heard, and approval before payment, plus a requirement of a final invoice. The defense says none of that appeared on the docket, highlighting that the distribution agents paid out $1 million to themselves without an invoice or explanation. They connect that directly to the accounting completeness. Without fee applications or invoices, the court can't know what the intermediary charged to liquidate assets, what those assets sold for, or what net proceeds entered the fund. On custody, document 165 reflects the SEC's argument that assets were managed like bank deposits, used in secondary transactions. Document 168 attacks that as incompatible with securely held in escrow. arguing that using a standard Coinbase exchange account is like parking $15 million in a basic, non-FDIC insured checking account, the email chain, and the 2019 warning signs. To prove these are not new complaints, the defendants point to document 169-2, an email chain from the very first week of the case. SEC counsel asked if there was any issue with using Gemini for custody. Reggie Middleton replied that there are several issues and specifically asked for the insurance policy. Despite these early warnings of custodial adequacy and insurance, the assets were still moved to a standard account. Document 169-2 show that custody and insurance were live concerns from the start, not arguments invented years later to delay the case. Commingling insurance and exposure. Document 161-1 goes further. It moves the argument from a paperwork problem to a core custody problem. The commingling. It says that Dewey's own declaration describes assets being transferred and aggregated through secondary transactions, treated as fungible, much like commingled deposits. The insurance gap. It says that Coinbase's crime policy was capped platform-wide and did not function like a true account-level escrow protection. It says that assets worth between $8 and $16 million sat in this environment for nearly a year. This is the defense trying to show the actual exposure and custodial risk. It highlights the distance between what the court ordered and what the defense says actually happened, leaning on the SEC's own custody rule. The impossible record. First, let's talk about the glitch in the matrix. In document 159, the SEC was compelled to submit a full, complete accounting. But when the defense looked at the escrow tables, they found a transfer dated November 6, 2026. For those paying attention, this document was filed in January of 2026. The defense argues you cannot discharge a fiduciary or approve final accounting when the record shows an impossible date for a material transaction. It suggests that the records weren't just messy, they might be fundamentally unreliable. Document 168 also disputes the premise that all potential victims were paid 100% plus interest. Defendants argue the SEC filing says everyone was made whole, when that's clearly not the case. Procedural selective enforcement and the Seibert declaration. Why didn't the judge see this in the last report? And this brings us to the core of selective enforcement. Document 169, the declaration from counsel Franklin Jason Seibert, tells a district judge that the key arguments were never answered on their merits. The court struck the defendant's reply because of a minor formatting rule. Yet, document 168 points out that the SEC filed their motion a day late, had a certificate of service dated before the motion even existed, and the court accepted those without even a word. Adding to that, the SEC failed to submit their quarterly accounting reports as required by the final judgment, and when compelled by the court, admitted in document 157 that they needed time to create them. The defense says they never had a real chance to respond to the SEC's January 23rd consolidated accounting package before the matter was treated as fully briefed. By striking document 164, the defense argues that the court removed their most detailed response and then blamed them for failing to identify errors. Document 168 calls this a total breakdown of due process. Can someone help me understand this double standard in the comments below? The special master issue. Now let's circle back to the special master, or the neutral auditor. The magistrate judge said that the defense had not shown concrete harm, but the defense says that Rule 53 expressly allows the appointment of a master to perform an accounting. And it says this is exactly the kind of situation where one is needed. The factors: persistent disagreement, missing liquidation details, disputed custody, disputed invoices, and disputed lieu compliance. The defense's argument is basically this: if the court itself recognized the ongoing disagreement on whether the record itself was complete, then a neutral reconciliation is not some sideshow, it's the missing step. What happens next? Document 168 asks the district judge to throw out the magistrate's recommendation, appoint a special master, and order a complete net profits audit. This case isn't just about $3 million. It's about whether the legal process can be closed using a record that the defense says is incomplete on its face. Tell me what you think of all this in the comments. And don't forget to hit like and subscribe. It helps the algorithm find more people that might be interested in this case. And as always, thank you very much for all the support, and I'll see you in the next update.